Imagine playing a game of Monopoly and the bank gives loans to everyone at 2% to buy property. A few rounds later, newer, younger players join the game. But now, the property prices have increased a few times, and so they can't use the same loans that the older players used. To top it all off, most of the properties lie in the hands of only a few older players, and every time a new player rolls the die, they're guaranteed to give some of that go money to them. What should we do, and how did we get here? So how did we get here? Well, our plot begins with Bill Clinton in the 90s. His goal was to increase home ownership, specifically minority home ownership. But historically, minorities were quite poor, and so they couldn't get loans for homes. What he decided to do was to repeal the Glass-Steagall Act in 1999. Now, what's so important about this act? Well, this act was actually the act that reduced risk in the system. It mitigated it. But by repealing this act, what you do is you merge retail or commercial banking and investment banking. As prior to this, commercial banks were not allowed to do risky lending, as the whole system could collapse. But now with this risky lending, this allowed for subprime. Now, what was subprime? Well, subprime was where loans were given to people with poor credit scores or low incomes. So the people that were minorities, right? To help them get homes. A noble goal, right? However, the problem was this. The problem was that they couldn't pay these payments. But the thought process was that even if they default, we, as the bank, we will repossess this asset and we'll be able to sell it. So it's entirely risk-free, right? Then they decided to bundle this debt into MBSs, so mortgage-backed securities, as they need investment vehicles as a bank to make money. They then went to the rating agencies and presented this. And the rating agencies rated this as AAA, completely safe, risk-free. But I suppose it would be when the Wall Street executives are paying you under the table to say that it is. And what did this lead to? As we all know, this led to the 2008 financial crash. And even though this was meant to be a Great Depression, basically, they managed to financially engineer their way out of this. Now, how did they do this? Well, they took some lessons from Japan. They had crashed earlier. They dropped rates to near zero and they introduced quantitative easing for the first time, which is essentially, this is an oversimplification, but it's essentially printing money but electronically. And because bonds and stocks, they were tanking, right? This easy money started to flow into real estate, into properties, and this re-inflated asset prices. So what actually happened is those that were on salaries and wages, which is obviously the vast majority of the people, their wages did not keep up as quickly as the asset prices were inflating. And so what we get is that you feel poorer today and the people with assets are richer than ever. Even though those that created the financial collapse, not only were they not penalized, but in fact, they became richer, obscenely rich, levels to which they never imagined. And something that I think is very important for you to understand is remortgaging. Remortgaging was where, for example, you have an 100k mortgage, right? So £100,000 mortgage. What happens is, thanks to this economic policy, house prices go up to 200k. What you then do is you remortgage your home. So you get the 100k difference and you then put that into a different home. And you basically keep repeating this process until what happens is you have basically a property empire of like 30 homes and you keep charging, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000 a month. And very quickly you become very, very rich. In fact, this is a true story. I actually have a guy who lives kind of nearby and he owns 30 homes. And even though I don't know how much he charges for each one, given that we're in London, he's charging at least 2k a month. So imagine 60k a month for breathing. Most people don't even earn 60k a year. So let's now talk about how this exists in the frame of the UK. And we have to start with Margret Thatcher. So Margaret Thatcher, as we know, was the PM of the United Kingdom from 1979 to 1990. Her goal was to make people homeowners, as she thought that true wealth is owning a home. So what did she do? Well, she introduced the scheme Right to Buy in 1980. And what this scheme was designed to do was to make council tenants the owners of the home they were renting. So obviously this proved very popular at the time as homeowners were created overnight. But the councils that had sold the homes and subsequently had got the money were not allowed to reinvest into housing. So what did this lead to? Well, obviously, social housing stock plummeted. And this is the really ridiculous thing that I hope you understand from this video. Basically what happened is that people that were on low incomes, on welfare, etc., since they couldn't get social housing, right, the government basically started paying private landlords. And let me explain my logic and process behind this. So since they don't have social housing, the person has to go to the private market, right? And they rent from a landlord. Now, since they're from a low economic background and they have a low income, they struggle to pay for the rent. But the government, through the welfare system, steps in to cover that. So what you get is the government paying landlords money for a problem that they created, because this problem did not exist prior to the government doing this stupid thing. Because even though some people benefited, over time the problem just became bigger and bigger and bigger. And also, as I've written here, it becomes even harder for lower income people to own houses because the supply has decreased, but the demand obviously has not. And subsequently, the house prices start to rise. On top of the fact that the government start printing money slightly, which raises asset prices, further fueling this. And this is something that I also want to cover. These days, it's also very hard for high income people to buy homes. For example, I know a guy that's earning like 120k a year. He literally bought a one-bed house for 425k. I know a retired pilot, so obviously, you know, he's at the other end of the spectrum, he's already retired. When I went to his home is literally straight out of Hollywood. Like, even though it's in the UK, if I showed you a picture, you'd think you're in Hollywood, right? In the movies. Double garage, massive front garden, massive house, neighborhood so nice. And he was able to afford that. Obviously, he was a high income earner too, but obviously he's not buying a one bed for 400k. I didn't actually ask him how much his house cost, but I can assure you that it was definitely not 400k at the time. And now, related back to the video, in 2008, when the global financial crisis hit, the Bank of England also introduced QE and low rates. The rates were 0.5%, and the Bank of England basically created 200 billion. I forgot to mention this earlier, but the Fed, by 2010, had created 2 trillion. So, just to give you an idea of just how much money was created in that time frame, that is honestly a very hard number to imagine. Even though I read it, I can't fully quite comprehend just how much money that is. And London recovered within 5 years, and the average home recovered within 7, only thanks to the fact that they engineered this financially. Because what we were meant to get was a depression, but through this financial engineering, they managed to postpone it, basically. And we're starting to feel the serious effects now. They also had, obviously, another round of QE in COVID, where they delayed it even further. But every delay just delays the inevitable, and it subsequently becomes even more painful up until the point of collapse. And in regards to these house prices, I was comparing this with Dow, where in 1929, the Dow took 29 years post-1929 to recover to its 1929 peak. Now, why am I comparing it to the Dow? As obviously the Dow is an index. And the reason being is because house prices in the US post-1929 had obviously collapsed too. But because of World War II and what happened during World War II and after World War II, house prices were able to recover much more quickly, thanks to government policy such as the GI Bill and government-backed mortgages, hence allowing the housing sector to pick up again. But in relation to stocks, if I were to compare the Dow with, for example, the FTSE or S&P, the S&P and FTSE, they managed to recover within 4 years post-2008. 4 years, not 25, but 4. And this was thanks to their, financial engineering. But now I just want to cover where this leaves us now. And then we're going to cover how the cycle works so that you fully understand where we are and what's going to happen so that you can better prepare and protect yourselves and your families. So, where are we now? Well, house price to income ratios are currently absurd. A healthy house price to income ratio would be 1 to 3, 1 to 4, 1 to 4.5, something like that. Hence why mortgages are usually 4 times your annual salary. Max 4.5, right? But in the UK, what do we see? The average ratio is 1 to 7. 1 to 7. And then don't even get me started on London. London is approximately 1 to 12. So if you ever plan on buying a home in London, honestly, just spend that money on a lottery ticket instead. No, I'm just kidding. Don't do that. And why have I written RR? Well, it's because unfortunately, not just in the UK, not just in America, but honestly in the entire world, for young people, being told to buy a house is basically the same as being told to buy a Rolls Royce. Basically impossible. But the sad thing is that a house is a necessity, and a Rolls Royce is obviously not. And on that note, we're now going to start covering why Q4 should be the land price crash and to get into the full cycle. So now let's understand why property prices will peak in Q4 of 2026. So firstly, this is a theory proposed by Fred Harrison, who is an exceptional economist. He predicted the 1989 to 1992 slump, and most importantly, and most impressively in my opinion, is that he predicted the great financial crisis in 2008 in 1997. He predicted it 11 years earlier, which is truly remarkable. His model is the following, that there's an 18-year boom-bust cycle, specifically of land prices and subsequently of property prices. And with that being said, we're going to go through the 5 stages of his cycle so that we understand where we were, where we are, and where we're going. So, stage 1 of the cycle is recovery. Confidence is low, banks are cautious, and credit is tight. And naturally, this is because there's just been a crash. Something else that I should add that I haven't written here is that fear is running rampant because loads of people have lost their jobs, they've lost their livelihood, and subsequently they're very scared. Also, few investors are willing to buy as they're spooked. Most of them just got burned. And prices relative to incomes are quite low. So right now is actually the perfect time to be buying if you're educated and if you have disposable money. But yeah, as I've written here, most are too scarred. Something that you should know, which is very useful in these times, is that typically, this is more useful actually preceding a crash, but companies that have inelastic demand, which means that even if prices rise, their goods will still be bought, for example, food stores, typically do very well during crashes. So I haven't written it here, but for example, Walmart, Dollar Tree, those kind of stores, right? And contrarian investors are buying it all up. One of the most notable retail contrarian investors I can tell you about is this guy called Dominic Kosteris. I hope I pronounced his name right. He was just a high school teacher, right? And prior to 2008, he thought about buying property, but he didn't. The reason being is because he said that the deals didn't make sense, and he was absolutely right. What he then did is that after the 2008 crash, after it actually crashed, he started buying up properties, and within 2 years, his rental income alone was able to make more than his full-time salary. And then he repeated this in the 2020 pandemic. And during this time of the recovery, government and central bank policy is very stimulative, very supportive, right? So you have QE, you have stimulus checks, etc. As obviously most people have just lost their jobs and the economy needs to start to recover again. Also, construction has completely collapsed usually because obviously there are very few buyers at this time because most people don't have any income coming in and very few people also have savings. So a quick top tip is always make sure to have savings. Don't throw money in the bin just trying to look rich because real wealth is being able to be free, where you don't have a debt chain you down, and if the paycheck stops coming in, then what happens? Well, you're just cooked, right? So always make sure to have savings. Now, let's advance onto the second stage of the cycle, which is expansion. So stage 2 of the cycle, expansion. So confidence starts to rise again, and more importantly, normal buyers start buying again, not just contrarians. So en masse, the fear has subsided. Also, employment rates have started to increase as well as wages as the economy has started to recover. Typically though, prices start to increase, and this is due to more demand than supply. Because don't forget, during the crash, obviously some businesses have gone bankrupt. For example, say there were 5 dry cleaners in your area, there are now 2. And if the demand starts to pick up again, you still only got 2 dry cleaners, right? And they can only do so much. Hence, they have to increase their prices. And in this stage, this is actually healthy growth, not just speculative. Construction also starts to pick up, to start meeting the demand as well. And this is the most important thing of all, credit loosens. So what does that actually mean? Banks are more willing to give out loans again because they're more confident, right? And why is this actually important and why is it good? Well, the reason being is, let me give you the example of a farmer. So if the farmer does all his work manually, obviously that's a very time-consuming task and the efficiency is quite low. But if he's then given a loan to get a tractor, for example, he can now improve his productivity drastically. He can do way more per unit time than before. And subsequently, his income can therefore increase, because if he gets 5 crops per hour before, and now he gets 20 crops per hour, well, those are 15 more crops that he can sell. So this is usually real organic growth, and as I already said, prices typically rise in line with incomes and fundamentals. In the UK, we had the Help to Buy scheme in 2013, which was set up by the government. And the idea of the scheme was that these were government-backed equity loans, and this would make house prices recover faster and also make it easier for people to get homes. Also, there's a very prevalent newspaper shift, because prior to this, newspapers are like, oh, is it safe to buy a home? You know, should you buy a home? Whereas now they suddenly switch to get on the ladder before it's too late. And the thing about this phase is that because the fundamentals are actually sound, it seems safe, but then this is what makes the next stage so easy to miss. So stage 3, the winner's curse. Typically, this happens about 7 years into the cycle because people get nervous. They think to themselves, hang on, prices are rising, just like they were prior to the crash, and that wasn't so long ago. So they get nervous and they want to get out. But historically, what this is it's just a temporary slowdown or dip. It is not a full-scale crash just yet, of course. And this is just like in 2015 to 2016. If you remember that period, we had an economic cool down, and it just turned out to be a local maximum, you know, just a slight peak, went down, and now we're up again. And you're probably wondering to yourself, where does this name actually come from? Well, it refers to the overeager, or as I would call them, FOMO, fear of missing out, buyers, right? So these are people that they really want to get in. They feel like they're missing the train, you know, they got to get on the train. And then what happens? The market starts to cool, right? As I've written here. So you buy at the local top, only for cooling in the market after you buy. So sure, you won the bidding war, right? You managed to get the property, but at what cost? So, in fact, I think that's the perfect summary of, you know, that phrase, I've won by what cost? Well, that would be that. Because imagine buying a property, say, for 400k, and then you're down 20k a month later. I don't know about you, but I'll be pretty nervous. Very, very important thing here is that the public and media typically mistake this for the start of a next crash. Obviously, it's because the prior crash is still kind of fresh in their minds, and people get nervous, you know. But historically, as I already mentioned, this is just a mid-cycle dip. But this is preceding the next thing, the speculative leg up. And weaker, more curious investors are shaken out, right? They get scared. They think, oh, you know, this is right before the crash. I better get out. I better get what I've already got and run. And then those guys that stay in, they're like, no, I'm in this for the long run, you know. And they become more and more speculative. And this leads us to the next stage, which is the boom phase. And this is what we're in right now. So stage 4, the boom phase. This is where we're at right now. So after the mid-cycle dip, prices start to rise again, right? And for some reason, the mentality goes from caution to euphoria. People are like, oh, prices are never going to go down again. Prices are only going to go up from here, right? I don't really understand the logic behind it, but typically that's what happens. And more importantly, borrowed money starts going into speculation rather than improving things and improving productivity and producing real wealth. So for example, more borrowed money goes into land value, which is just speculating that the price will go up over time, as opposed to a productive investment, such as the farmer example I gave you earlier on. Also, buying increases on the basis that prices simply must go higher, as opposed to real fundamentals, such as income or rental yield. And just asset prices start to rise in general, right? Also, leverage increases system-wide. So you get more and more buy-to-let, which is where people buy homes with the idea to just rent them out. Also, people, more specifically banks, are more willing to just do interest-only lending because what they want is the nominal sum to still remain there. As in banking and economics, debts are assets. I covered this in one of my prior videos. I go more in depth there. And also remortgaging, which is what I mentioned earlier in the video, where, for example, your house goes from 100k to 200k, and then you get the 100 in between, and you put in another house, and so on and so forth, and you get the property empire. Something that I've written, which is not directly a part of the theory, but it's 100% true, is that speculation, unfortunately, pays more than work. And the crazy thing right now, just to highlight how speculative we've become, is the US stock market. That's a brilliant example. So typically the stock market is meant to be 0.75 to 1 times the GDP of the nation. In America, it's roughly 220%, so 2.2 times. 2.2 times. So basically, the economy is worth less than the stock market, which is ridiculous. Something that's very common in the stage as well is that lending loosens more. So banks are more willing to give out those riskier loans, just like subprime, just so that they capture more of the market share. And something that's very relevant for you is don't be a FOMO buyer at this time, because buying a US tech stock at all-time highs is probably not going to help you 5 to 10 years down the line. And a very good top tip, which is also very relevant to yourself, is watch out for people being enticed into high leverage buying right before the top. And with all that being said, we now need to go into stage 5, the crash. So stage 5, the crash. And we'll use the mechanism to understand and explore why crashes occur. So first off, these land purchases, right, they're a transfer of wealth from one person to the next. They do not create any new wealth. And the debt that funds this, though, needs to actually be serviced. And it needs to be serviced by real incomes. But asset prices are rising higher than incomes. And because of this, your income just isn't rising fast enough to meet the debt that needs to be serviced. But then begs the question, what actually triggers the cascade of events that leads to the real crash? And it's usually a specific event. So we have rising interest rates, credit event, a bank failure, or just a piece of bad economic news. And then we follow the same sequence. Transactions dry up. Now, why is this the case? It's because sellers are no longer willing to accept lower prices. But then forced sellers appear, and they change the whole game. These forced sellers are usually people that either got divorced or they lost their jobs and subsequently their incomes, and they just need the money now. So they're willing to sell at a lower price than the market price. These lower sale prices are now the comparables. So when you're a buyer, you're looking at the price, you're like, oh, that's say 350k. Oh, this guy wants 400k. Oh yeah, I'm not going to buy from him, right? I'll get the guy who's at 350. And subsequently, these guys have to start lowering their prices. And the prices start to fall more rapidly. It's kind of like a snowball, right? And then panic sets in, and then it falls even further. So the snowball keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. To top it all off, credit tightens. So the people that need money the most are unable to get it. And leveraged investors are the ones that are hit the hardest. Frankly speaking, they're absolutely cooked during this period because they're the people that during this time, during the speculation, thought the prices were going to the moon. They would never come down again. But unfortunately, they did for those people. So if you're leveraged, obviously not financial advice, but I would just suggest to watch out. And with all this being said, this naturally leads us to the next stage, stage 1. And the 3 things that happen prior to stage 1 actually commencing are prices fall far enough bad debt is cleared, and confidence reaches all-time lows. But crashes, as with the recoveries, are uneven. So in the next slide, we're going to cover what to expect. So as already mentioned, the crashes are unequal, as is the recovery. And typically the recovery is very slow and unequal. Some areas snap back much more quickly than others, and others stagnate for a decade plus. And in fact, some areas never recover. In the UK, if we're looking at it from that lens, London recovered quite quickly, within 5 years, post-2008. But the Northeast took 13 years. That's a very long time, and that's a very big difference, 2.6 times. So what do we actually learn from this? Financial hubs are favored. So if you look at the cities that recovered post-2008, you'll always see that it's a financial hub. New York, Hong Kong, London. And the reason being is because international money starts flocking in those places and concentrating there. Also, typically major cities that have a lot of jobs and a very big population, specifically a young population, see a quick snapback because they're desired by investors. Because when you have a young working population, they can keep working for a long time. It's much better to put your money there than, for example, in a random village where the whole population is 60 plus. You can't get, as bad as it sounds, as much out of them compared to the young people in the big city. And a newspaper, in fact, a very famous national newspaper, said that house prices have recovered. And it said this in 2012. And although this was true for Londoners, for Northeasterners, that was completely false. In fact, they had to wait almost another 9 years for that. And just to explain the most devastating example of a crash, that would be Japan. So Japan in 1989, despite it being 13 times smaller than the US, its land was valued at 4 times the whole of the US. So that's just obscene, right? And Japan underwent its bubble bursting in 89 to 90, right? And what we see is that prices after the bursting of the bubble basically collapsed. And they kept decreasing for 15 continuous years. Now, after popping of the bubble, most Japan hasn't recovered, to be honest. But Tokyo, which is obviously the capital of Japan, saw a much better improvement and a recovery as a whole than the rest of the country. And what we learn from that is because the wealth of the country is basically concentrated in the capital city. Unfortunately, that is true for basically every single nation worldwide, where most of the country's money just goes into the capital city, whether it be productive or unproductive. So what we can expect is that cities or even towns potentially, they have young populations and growing populations, ideally growing quite quickly, and any financial hubs will likely recover the quickest from any upcoming crash. And on that note, I'll start covering what I think will happen. So what do I expect to happen? Well, first things first, rates must remain unchanged. Affordability will worsen, transaction volumes will decrease, and then forced sellers will subsequently appear, and price declines from 2027 to 2028. I specifically expect Q2 to start seeing the real price declines, to be honest. And yes, let me explain why they cannot raise rates. Well, as we all know, the US government is $40 trillion in debt. And their interest alone is over $1 trillion a year, right? So if they were to increase their rates, they would have to pay even more to service their debt. But honestly, at that point, the whole scheme would collapse because they simply would not be able to pay it back. They rely on these US treasuries to keep the Ponzi scheme going. They rely specifically on the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and also Japan. For example, recently, why do you think the US helped Japan with their worsening yen? The reason being is because Japan is the biggest holder of US treasuries. If Japan dumps their treasuries, it's gone. Like, the whole system collapses. So by making the yen stronger relative to the dollar, it makes it easier for Japan to buy more treasuries. But these financial engineering magical things, they can't continue forever. Eventually the fundamentals will catch up. But now you may be asking yourself, why can't they just lower rates? Well, they can't lower them because if they lower them too much, let's start off with what lowering rates actually means. Lowering rates means that it's easier for people to borrow, right? And one thing that I've mentioned in my prior classes is that banks have the ability to basically create money through credit. Credit allows them to create money. With this credit, they're injecting liquidity into the system. There's more money and subsequently people feel richer, right? Even though they have to pay it back. But when there's more money in the system, your money inherently becomes worth less. And it reaches a point where if your money is literally worth nothing, and since the dollar has literally lost like 97% of its value since 1913, if it were to literally reach, say, 99 or 100%, 100% in my opinion is impossible, but say it were to decrease even further, what would actually happen? Well, in America, people feel very desperate because they cannot even afford to buy food. And as I mentioned in the prior class, America is basically a standing army of its own because there are 300 million guns. And if you're the government, that's pretty scary because every citizen can incite violence and things can very quickly spiral out of control. So if you're the government, the last thing you want to do is to make the American population desperate. So what you have to do is you have to just maintain this position that we're currently at. You know, they can't improve it, but they also can't allow it to get worse. And subsequently, they do these drastic measures, but ultimately it just prolongs the suffering and the pain. And when things collapse, it'll just make it even harsher, you know. Also, because of this stupid conflict in Iran, what the Americans have actually done is they've increased fertilizer prices. Now, what does that actually mean for you? It means that your food's going to become more expensive because 2/3 of the fertilizers that were passing through the Hormuz Strait have now basically been stopped. On top of that, since fertilizers have now become 50% more expensive, you should expect your food to increase relative to that. And the sad thing is that your salary will not reflect it. So once again, the government's made you poorer without you voting for that, right? So much for being a democracy. And a side point that I really want to mention about those rates earlier, about banks giving out credit, right, is that inflation is actually the tax on the poor, as I've covered many times in my prior classes. But what I want you to know is that inflation actually transfers the wealth from the have-nots to the have-yots. So what we'll see even more so now is that more and more rich people become more and more obscenely rich, whereas the general populace becomes poorer. And this is because fiat currencies continue to decline in their value, whereas assets increase nominally in said value. So let's summarize what we learned. How did we get here? We had cheap credit and deregulation, so removing the Glass-Steagall Act in 1999. And this led to subprime, obviously one of the dumbest things in human history, which collapsed the whole global economy in 2008. Then we got QE and near zero rates, financially engineering ourselves out of the crash, and thereby assets were reinflated, and as I already said, the crash was not played out naturally as it should have. Then the remortgaging meta. So the remortgaging meta, as I mentioned, you remortgage against your house because your house keeps increasing in value. You get what the difference is. You put that. So in fact, I forgot to mention this, but you can put that as a down payment towards another home, and then that's even cheaper for you. So you could get like 2 or 3 down payments if you have a substantial sum, and then you remortgage those out, and very quickly, you know, properties are concentrated in the hands of only a few, and new buyers that actually need a home, you know, to buy a home, not just to rent it forever, are priced out. Then Thatcher's right to buy destroyed social housing, and we basically have not recovered since. And where we're at now. So house prices to income ratios in London are completely unsustainable, 1 to 12, and nationwide 1 to 7 is also catastrophic, to be honest. And then most importantly, what history says happens. So transaction volumes dry up, then we get forced sellers that drag the prices down, and then we have a slow, uneven recovery. And with all that being said, the next video is going to be on why inflation is necessary. Yes, you heard me right, why inflation is necessary. It'll make more sense in that video. I hope that you got some real value out of this. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section down below, and subscribe if you got any value.